The laboratory is one of the most controversial buildings in Clash of Clans, and for good reason. While the game has evolved dramatically over the past 13 years with faster upgrade times, more builders, and countless quality of life improvements, the laboratory has remained stuck in the past. It's essentially the same building it was back in 2013, except now it's responsible for upgrading way more troops, spells, and even siege machines, and that is a massive problem that Supercell needs to address. So today, I want to dive into exactly why the laboratory has become the biggest bottleneck in the game, and whether or not Supercell's recent solutions actually fix anything. So let's get right into it. The first thing we need to talk about is just how absurdly long it takes to max out everything at the higher Town Hall levels. At Town Hall 16 and 17, it takes nearly an entire year to upgrade everything, and that's assuming you're upgrading something 24/7 without any breaks, which is honestly pretty unrealistic for most players. Compare that to building upgrades where you have 6 builders working simultaneously, and you can see the problem immediately. Even with 6 builders, you'll finish all your building upgrades way before you finish your laboratory upgrades, and the thing is, this gap isn't even the worst at the top Town Hall levels, which is the worst part. Right now, it takes about twice as long for the lab upgrades when compared to the building upgrades at the higher town halls, but if you look between town halls 12 and 15, it's around 2.5 to 3 times longer, which is what makes these levels feel like a big grind. And that isn't good because a majority of active players are in that range. You don't see this big of a difference in anything else across all Town Hall levels, and this clearly is something we need to look into because the lab upgrades times are just disproportionately longer, and to see why the upgrades times are out of proportion, we need to go back and just look at how the game has progressed since the beginning, because that is where we will find the answer. In the early days, it was pretty manageable. You had a handful of troops to upgrade and a few spells, and that was basically it. The upgrades didn't take too long, and since the game was still new, people were patient with the progression system. However, things would start to change pretty quickly as Supercell kept adding more and more content to the game without actually changing how the laboratory worked. First, you had Dark Elixir troops added to the game, which meant even more things to upgrade in the laboratory. Then came Dark Elixir spells, which added another layer to the grind. And then siege machines were introduced, which also get upgraded in the laboratory, and you would get new units in all of these categories, and all of this just kept piling up year after year. But the laboratory itself never changed. It was still just one building that could only upgrade one thing at a time, and that single limitation has become an absolutely massive bottleneck as the game has grown. And even though Supercell does reduce upgrade times whenever new levels come out, it still doesn't matter because everything gets reduced in proportion, and like we just talked about, the proportions are completely off. And let's talk about what this actually means for players, because the impact is pretty significant. For casual players who just want to attack and have fun, the laboratory can feel like a never-ending grind that holds them back from progressing to the next town hall level. Sure, you don't need to max out every single troop, but if you want to be competitive in clan wars or clan war leagues, you do need to have your main attack strategies maxed out, and that can take months. And for hardcore players who actually want to max out everything before moving up, the laboratory is basically forcing them to sit at their current town hall level for way longer than they need to, just waiting for research to finish while all their builders sit idle. And this is one of the main reasons we have seen so many people start rushing in the game. Now, to Supercell's credit, they have tried to address this problem in recent years, but their solutions have been pretty half-hearted in my opinion. The biggest change came with the Town Hall 17 update in November of 2024 when they introduced the Lab Assistant. This is basically the laboratory version of the Builder's Apprentice, and it works the exact same way. The Lab Assistant can work on your current laboratory upgrade for 1 hour per day, and depending on what level you upgrade him to, he can speed up your research by up to 12 times during that hour. At max level, that means you're getting 12 hours of research done in just 1 hour, which sounds pretty good on paper. However, there are a few problems with this solution. First of all, the Lab Assistant only works for 1 hour per day, and then he goes on cooldown for 23 hours. So even at max level, you're only saving 12 hours per day, which doesn't sound like a ton when some upgrades take weeks to complete. Second, and this is the bigger issue, fully upgrading the Lab Assistant costs thousands of gems. That's a massive investment investment, and for free-to-play players, that's basically not an option unless you've been saving gems for years. And this really highlights what I think is the core problem with how Supercell has approached the laboratory issue. Instead of actually fixing the underlying problem by giving us a second laboratory or allowing us to upgrade multiple things at once, they've created a gem-based solution that essentially forces players to spend money if they want to speed up their progress. We also have the Goblin Researcher, which costs a bunch of gems as well, and it only allows you to concurrently research something else. You still have to spend the resources and wait the full duration. So this also just isn't worth it for most people, and overall it is clear that these solutions don't really help a large majority of players. And the thing is, there are much better solutions that Supercell could implement if they actually wanted to fix this issue. The most obvious one would be to simply allow players to research 2 things at once, and this would instantly fix the problem and make it so it doesn't take twice as long to do the lab upgrades versus the builder upgrades. But instead of doing this, they just gave solutions that could be considered pay to win, and they haven't addressed the core problem, which is that the laboratory has too much responsibility for being a single building that upgrades one thing at a time. And I think what frustrates me the most about this whole situation is that Supercell has shown they're willing to make big changes to other parts of the game to improve player experience. They removed training times entirely, which was a massive quality of life improvement. They've increased the amount of loot you can get, along with tons of other things throughout the last few years that have just made the game easier and more fun, with the exception of the laboratory. This building really is just outdated because it has the same functionality, but has 5 times as many things to upgrade now compared to the beginning, and this is the biggest problem that Supercell just hasn't addressed yet, and it seems like they are just ignoring it. Now, I do want to be fair here and acknowledge that not everyone thinks the laboratory is a problem. Some players, especially those who don't care about maxing out everything, would argue that the laboratory is fine because you don't actually need to upgrade every single troop. And that's true to an extent. If you're a casual player who just uses 1 or 2 attack strategies, you can absolutely ignore most of the laboratory upgrades and still have a great time playing the game. But I think that's kind of missing the point, because the issue isn't whether you can play the game without maxing the laboratory, it's whether the laboratory's design is good and fair compared to the rest of the game's progression systems, and I would argue it's not. The laboratory is the only part of the game where you're stuck upgrading one thing at a time with no way to speed it up except by spending a ton of gems. You do have the pet house, but there are way less pets and the overall progression for them is fine, so that doesn't really count, though it could end up having the same fate as the laboratory in a couple of years as more and more pets are added. Now, let me also address the argument that some people make, which is that the laboratory is supposed to be a long-term grind and that's just part of the game's design. And I get where that argument is coming from, because Clash of Clans has always been a game about long-term progression and patience. But I think there's a difference between a healthy long-term grind and an outdated system that's become a bottleneck. Like, yes, progression should take time, but it should also feel rewarding and balanced across all aspects of the game. And right now, the laboratory just doesn't feel balanced compared to everything else. And I think the other thing to consider is that the game's population is much different now than it was 10 years ago. Back in the early days, most players were relatively patient and willing to wait for upgrades because the game was new and exciting. But nowadays, the mobile gaming market is way more competitive and players have a lot more options. If Clash of Clans wants to retain players and attract new ones, it needs to modernize its progression systems to match player expectations. And that includes fixing the laboratory. We've already seen them speed up the pacing of the game by making town halls come out faster, so all they really need to do now is fix the laboratory. But let me know down below what you guys think of this, and with that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one.